Wow, they coaxed me down here by changing mentions. Yeah, that was the great way to do it. Very good. Thank you. Let's do this. Okay. Pull more chairs.
Yeah, we could just grab some of the chairs from over here and over there. Fellas, hi. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Center for Dewey Studies. If you haven't got a chance to grab a snack or something to drink, there's stuff up here. Feel free. And to introduce our speaker today, I'm going to invite Nick Guardiano, who is a library faculty and the Alwin Carus Chair of Archival Studies and Philosophy.
Yeah, pretty much.
Come on up.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. We have Stephen Houchins here today, a master's student in the philosophy program at SIU. This is a joint Alwin C. Carus lecture by Stephen and a lunchtime talk with the Dewey Center. So it's nice to do a collaboration. Stephen was awarded the Alwin C. Carus Research Grant, and this is a grant that's awarded by the Special Collections Research Center. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about that grant and who Alwin C. Carus is. He is the youngest son, the last born son of Paul Carus, who is the editor of the Open Court Publishing Company. And if you're not aware of the Open Court Publishing Company, this is one of the earliest academic presses in the United States, and it was located not far away in LaSalle, Illinois, which is about an hour south of Chicago. Alwin, like his father, Paul Carus, was really curious guy. He was interested in archaeology. He was a chemist and a physicist was his training, but he had interest in archaeology, astronomy, and other fields. So he kind of kept up that intellectual curiosity, and he helped run some of the companies after his father and his grandfather passed away up there. And he helped donate the open court materials that are now at the Special Collections Research Center. So this grant supports his legacy, and it supports work, research in American philosophy generally, such as John Dewey. So I'll hand it over to Stephen now. His presentation is Dewey's Philosophy of Language. You had a subtitle, I think it was Past and Future, right? So you've been working in the archive now for about a month on his grant, and he's here today to tell us about some of his findings. All yours.
Set one thing up here with the Zoom stuff. Share. There it is. Share. Okay.
All right, thank you, everybody. So this project on Dewey's Philosophy of Language first started about a year ago in Matt Brown's John Dewey seminar. I wrote my paper, decided to do it on Dewey's Philosophy of Language, surveyed some of the main secondary and primary sources on that. And I ended up realizing what a small field it was. I mean, Dewey's Philosophy of Language is probably the most neglected or among the most neglected subjects in Dewey studies. You can count on almost on two hands sort of all the major publications on it. So I had this paper where I looked at a lot of the secondary sources, and I looked at what sources of Dewey's works were they using to derive their idea of what Dewey thinks about language. So that was sort of the previous version of this paper. The version I'm working on now is updating all of that, not only looking at all the published sources, primary sources, that is published works by Dewey, where he talks about language, but also trying to look at his unpublished sources, which we have in the Special Collections Research Center. And so the focus, I'll give a little little background on my paper, but the focus of this talk is going to be on what do we learn about Dewey's philosophy of language? What does Dewey have to say about language in his manuscripts? So let's see. So a little sort of background on just sort of academic philosophy of language. Broadly, you have analytic, continental, and American philosophy. So these are sort of broad strokes. Distinctions, when you get down to the details, these distinctions break down. Most philosophers hate the distinction between analytic and continental, and yet a lot of philosophers still use them. So when it comes to philosophy of language, analytic philosophy tends to be focused on semantics and syntax. That is, semantics being the intrinsic or definitional meaning of words, and syntax being the structure by which those words are arranged to produce meaningful sentences. Continental philosophy is extremely broad, just like analytic. It's highly diverse and variegated. But a lot of one of the big themes of continental philosophy of language is the way in which language, in particular languages, shape us and shape our minds and our subjectivities, and inextricably tinge how we interpret the world around us. American philosophy, closely associated with pragmatism and American pragmatism. American philosophy tends to be focused when it comes to language, along with most other philosophical ideas, on their relation to experience and their relation to practice. I think Dewey's philosophy of language has all three of these characteristics and has a lot more to it. So when I looked at most of the secondary publications, that is, scholars writing about Dewey's philosophy of language, I found that most of them use a lot of the same sort of handful of sources, which are very important. Books by Dewey like Experience and Nature, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. Probably among his, what you may arguably say are his three most important works, the third, or perhaps the first, that's how you would arrange them, the other one being Democracy and Education. So these are sort of magnum opus of Dewey's. So it's only natural that they lent themselves to be sort of the most examined sources for language. He talks a lot about language in both of those. A couple sources I argued in the previous version of my paper that have a lot more to say are that have not been put in the literature much, are How We Think. Dewey's sort of it's a book where he kind of breaks down in almost step-by-step form his philosophy of education and how we might go about affecting it in education. And also he has this paper called What Does It Mean to Be a Linguistic Sign or Name that I argued is also really important. So later, I should have put the dates, 1949 when he wrote that. So real quick, in Experience in Nature, Dewey says language is simultaneously that which sort of creates the mind. It's sort of in as much as we can talk about mind, the accretion of language is what sort of generates that which we call the mind. It's what makes experience meaningful. Language transforms experience from just stimulation and sensation into meaningful aboutness. So instead of sort of kind of having a collection of stimuli, language transforms that into a thing which can be used or acted upon. And in Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, we get a lot about language. It's an extremely complex book, but one of the most salient features is that language is he says, the tool of all tools. It's the utility. It's almost what allows everything else to be made useful to us. And language also has the ability to abstract as a form from experience. So language allows us to refer to things that are not there. If we didn't have that faculty, if we didn't have that ability or that use, we would be dependent on what we refer to really being there. We'd have to wait for it to happen in order to gesture at it. Now, in how we think, I think what we get is Dewey sort of breaks down in, I would say, simpler, easier to digest language is distinction between a sign and a symbol. So a sign is something that is really in front of you, that's there in experience, that also indirectly can refer to something else. Whereas a symbol is something that is purely abstract, like a word or a letter, which has no need to refer directly to experience or to existence even, which we can use to still think about things and to transmit that thought to other people and think about things together that are not really there. And in what does it mean to be a linguistic sign or name, he takes this, he talks about the capacity of language and of names and signs in particular to be indicators of use. And that's actually, he thinks, where they get a lot of their meaning from. So let's see. So in the secondary literature, Dewey's philosophy of language gets some criticism. Other people, so Max Black is an analytic philosopher of language who has sort of what is sort of has been considered to be the authoritative analysis on Dewey's philosophy of language. I think that is slightly unfortunate. He argues that Dewey falls to what he calls the dogma of substantive meaning. He believes Dewey assumes that just in the way that he talks about language and the way he talks about words and symbols, that they have this sort of one-to-one correspondence with an object. I don't quite think that's true. There are other people in the literature who argue against that, such as Torius Midgarten. Don't need to get into the weeds on that, but I think what we find in the manuscripts, among many other things, is actually ways in which Dewey was not vulnerable to that critique. Black also thought that Dewey failed to distinguish between the way that words and sentences function. And so this is sort of a classic concern of analytic philosophy of language, is that you have to be, on those terms, you have to be able to account for the way that words combine to form meaningful sentences, and he doesn't believe Dewey does that. Again, Torius Midgarten believes that that this is not quite the case. He makes a sort of a vague reference to social processes being the ways in which words and sentences combine. I think that can be elaborated, and I think the materials and the grounds to elaborate on that are in his published works, but are also in his manuscripts. And a couple other sort of questions that I had as I was researching Dewey's philosophy of language, the more that I had read about it, at least in the published works. Is there a sort of, do we reach a point, what's the threshold? Is there a threshold at which we go from sort of being from sensation to meaningful experience to having a mind through which language or together with which language works? And also, what exactly are meanings? What is meaning? A lot about what you think about language and academically about your philosophy of language can very well hinge on what you think meaning is and where it comes from. So I also think these questions are answered in the manuscript, so let's get to them. Yeah, so quick note, as far as I'm aware, and could very well be wrong here, I have not come across a source that has written or utilized Dewey's manuscripts as far as language. And so I hope to change that. So the first manuscript that is really important here is Mental Development. Then there's, which was written in 1900. Then there's importance, significance, and meaning in 1950, communication and culture in 51, and an undated manuscript called Idiomatic Language and Philosophy. I think that is the one I'll focus on least because it's a single sheet of paper. There are some suggestive remarks on there, but the other three I think are the most important. So a couple. So this is idiomatic language and philosophy. I thought I'd include some pictures of the manuscripts. So I don't know if you can see it or read it too well. A word processor would have done Dewey a lot of good. Can anyone read that? What's on the sheet? Okay. Well, oh well. I won't read it too much, but suffice to say, it's a little bit difficult. But he talks about the way that he talks about the false intellectualism of philosophy and the way that he thinks that that relates to either having a kind of verb language or a language that has a lot of emphasis on verb use versus noun use. I think it's too bad that this is not dated because a big focus on Dewey's philosophy of language, especially in experience in nature, is the way that subject-object grammar can lend itself to what he calls variously abstraction or hypostatization, or which I think we would now more commonly call reification. So this is going to be a theory. I mean, this is going to be an important feature later. Dewey really doesn't like, calls it various names. I think at times he's called it the philosophical fallacy. The way in which we tend to abstract something out from its context, from the context in which it's created, its use is occasioned, outside of the context in which whose purposes that thing serves. And that's going to be a feature that Dewey will talk a lot about with language. Okay, so so this is John Dewey's handwriting. So this is the mental development manuscript, which is much easier to read. So in mental development, we get this really interesting passage. There's so much actually that's really interesting in these manuscripts, and I wish I could just sort of read all the interesting quotes to you. But there's a few that are really salient for our purposes. So he talks about in this manuscript, he's talking about the psychological development of children. John McDermott once famously said in an interview, which I believe was on YouTube, that if you don't have a theory of children, you don't have a theory of language. Dewey has a theory of children, and I think his theory of language is wrapped up in this, and I think it has really interesting import for talking about, what is sort of the process or the threshold, the magic line by where we go from having sort of, not totally raw and unmediated experience, but less mediated experience and less of a mind, and versus having more of it. So he talks, so this is what he calls the second stage. He calls it later infancy / the play period. So this is, between the ages of 2 and 3 and 6 and 7. He has the example of a child, interacting with a doorknob. And the doorknob goes from not even really being a thing. It just goes from being, it's just a collection of stimuli. But the more that the child interacts with the doorknob, the more the doorknob begins to suggest certain uses to the child. So I'll read from the quote here. The light is a stimulus to handling, and thus is something hard, smooth, and resisting as well as bright. Here, the thing as an object of consciousness may be said to begin. But after all, this thing is hardly more than a cross-reference of the child's own activities of seeing and handling. It is hardly objective. If for purposes of illustration, we may suppose that the child comes to recognize the doorknob as something through whose use he can, say, get away from the place where he is to a more desired spot, we have an illustration of the third stage. Here, The thing is a means to some personal end. It is hardly yet an objective doorknob. It is rather an interesting instrument in securing some more interesting results. But at the epoch just discussed, when the child turns it simply for the sake of turning it, simply that he may effect the opening and shutting of the door without any ulterior purpose, it is in principle just as much of an object to him as it is to any adult. Practically, he has defined it, although he is still, of course, far from the capacity to give an intellectual formulation of his practical definition. That intellectual definition would involve and be more demonstrative of language. So this is sort of the pre and co-linguistic process by which signification happens. So for Dewey, this process of interacting with something, and the ways in which we learn language as signifying, so the ways in which we may interact with objects. I mean, that process is that is how we develop our minds, quite literally. Now this is again, pretty early manuscript, 1900. Most of Dewey's stuff, published stuff on language is in the 20s and 30s and later in life. So it's just from a Dewey studies perspective, it's quite striking that this stuff is already it's already inchoate in 1900 for Dewey. But also we get a little bit of a discussion of what will later be what signs are about for Dewey. So here's another quote from Mental Developments, this page 2. The change from direct excitation to indirect or suggestion, so excitation being just stimulus, the change from excitation to indirect suggestion marks an increase not only in rationality of action, but of freedom. The child is no more enslaved to his sensations in themselves, or to his sensations in respect to securing the satisfaction of his own appetites, but rather he utilizes sensations as ordered cues or signals for activity. It calls forth a response not by itself, but in its relation to some larger organized movement. But in that light is taken as a sign or indication of that particular thing called the doorknob. So Dewey already is getting away from this idea that the objects which come to serve as signs are in some way tied down in a one-to-one relation with the words or the terms by which we refer to them. He says it calls forth a response not by itself, but in its relation to some larger organized sort of nexus of movement or activity. It's a little vague here, but it's going to become clearer in his later manuscripts. So we jump ahead 50 years and we get to important significance and meaning. So Dewey's thought has changed a lot in those 50 years. Not only has he written almost everything that he's known for in that 50 years, but also he meets another philosopher named Arthur Bentley. And then he produces a book with Arthur Bentley called Knowing and the Known, where he talks a lot more about behavior being important in the genesis or the ongoing process of signification. Nonetheless, it's not the kind of behaviorism that we might associate with someone like, say, B.F. Skinner, who would almost deny that there is a mind or that there is even subjectivity, only that there is outwardly observed behavior. It's not quite like that at all. So for importance, significance, and meaning, I'll see if I can abridge this a little bit for time. So Dewey, for Dewey, language in this piece is involving actions. He's much more explicit about the kinds of actions that we take, the kinds of purposes those serve, and the ways in which this process of, say, doing and undergoing, of acting on something, and also having that feedback and act on you, and the purposes for which you engage in that. It's much more explicit that this is where the meaning and significance of language is found. So he says that perceiving and observing is identical with paying heed to what is observed as directive or sign in further actions. I'll just skip to he comes to a point where he, after laying out this action-oriented program, comes to a point where he defines importance, significance, and meaning. So this process of, we might call it doing and undergoing, we might call it behavioral operations, we might call it a lot of things, but it is interacting with objects in your world for specific purposes and uses. And language sort of is a way of keeping a note, not only of past uses, but a signal for what future uses we might find in the objects of our world. So he says, for importance, when a transaction is intelligently conducted, it is intentional and deliberate. Environing conditions, so that's sort of what we think of as the more objective aspect of the world, object-oriented, and organic modes of responsive treatment, by which he means us, the organism, that is interacting with our environment. Each of them have to be weighed with respect to their importance. That is, with respect to the consequences, which are to end as termination quite as much as environing conditions that are employed as means. So the importance of something is found in the consequences that unfold when we take a particular course of action, utilizing specific instruments to that action. What's really important here is that when I say object, I'm not just talking about concrete things, as will become clear in a bit. What's really important for Dewey is instrumentality. Often his philosophy has sometimes been called instrumentalism. Dewey himself has called it that. Whether they're physical, whether they're material things right in front of us, or whether they are intellectual, whether they're verbal, we use these things to then affect certain consequences as we navigate the world. So in his definition of significance, he says, since this previous discussion should have made clear, environing conditions are weighed and estimated as signs, as indexes of how to proceed. Significance is a fit or suitable word to name their distinctive mode of importance, the distinctive way in which these things that we use for specific purposes, the types of consequences we can expect to unfold from using them. And finally, I think this is a really interesting part here, is when he talks about the meaning, and what meaning, he makes very clear what he thinks meaning is and what it consists of. When he talks about this, he makes a really interesting comment about the sort of the state of academic philosophy of language in his time, with which he had a lot of conflict. So he broadly in analytic philosophy of language, meaning has been taken as the domain of semantics. It's been taken to be that certain terms have certain intrinsic ways in which they mean things. Say their definitions or something. And so as a result of the way that Dewey's going to say they have abstracted meaning out of the context in which we use certain terms for specific purposes, meaning has been taken to be this kind of free-floating thing that's not tied down to a specific context. Its meaning has now become a difficult term to use. But if we understand that the interactions we have with our environment and specific purposes for which we use things like words or like the objects which words refer to, then we can use meaning, as he says, we can refer to the idiomatic usage of meaning to mean, which is to intend the suitability of meaning to name ways or modes of artfully skilled ways of organized action. So meaning for Dewey has to do with the means, quite literally, the means to specific ends for which we use instrumentalities in our environment. He has, let's see, do I have time? So he talks also in, I believe it is Communication and Culture, that he talks about the way that sort of magic and a much earlier stage in human cultural evolution, we might say, for a lack of material, what he calls material artifacts or material things or tools or objects to use in our environment, names were used as those instrumentalities to affect certain purposes in their environment. So another interesting thing that we get out of communication, this manuscript in particular, is when Dewey talks about these organism environment interactions, the way in which we interact with our environment, and he says when we hypostatize, when we reify the products of that process, such as meaning, such as the way we arrange words to form meaningful sentences, when we abstract that out, we don't just get a sort of, almost Platonic idea of what language is, as sort of having these unchanged essential meanings and structures of meaning. He thinks that's also the source of this odd idea of what it means to be mental and what experience means. So he says, transformations of the properties of the physical, physiological, so material, through cultural uses to which they are put. Cultural ends are hereby occasioned through this. This is wholly an affair or matter of use, office, function, services rendered. When hypostatized or reified, it is the source of the doctrine of psychological matter as mental, and the mental as the psychical in the sense of a specific order or kind of existence. The identification of experience, well, suffice to say, experience then describes that, the sort of private, innate, almost something like a soul. We now sort of identify that with Cartesianism. But he thinks that happens, we get to that place when we take all of these things that occur in these specific contexts, we take their products for granted, and we don't talk about the context or the processes out of which they arose and to which they have relevance ever again. And then that sort of becomes the dominant paradigm in which a lot of philosophical work on these subjects ends up being done. So finally, we have an undated manuscript, which is really interesting. It's called Reflections. Dewey wrote this at the behest of Paul Arthur Shilp, who was seeking to include he was seeking to include an entry in Dewey in the Library of Living Philosophers, which we had at SIU Carbondale. Paul Shilp created that and ran that here for a bit. He was here, I think, beginning in 1965. Dewey notes this in Reflections. He writes that Paul Shilp asked him. And he wanted Dewey to write a brief sort of summary of his general philosophy. And so Dewey tried, because he's written quite a few books and hundreds or possibly thousands of essays, probably hundreds, I think. But we have some interesting things here. So he says, history of progress in civilization is the record of freer and more intimate transactions carried on between words as artifacts, and those artifacts which are often seen as mechanical or servile. But linguistic artifacts free the latter. They free the sort of material objects or instrumentalities. But the latter, these material objects and the purposes for which we use them, give substance to the linguistic. Now, what's really interesting there is you might look at that and you might say, well, what does he mean by free? What does he mean by history of progress in civilization is the record of freer and more intimate transactions of people and organisms with their environment? Written a lot about democracy. This is a very common theme. I don't have time to get into his democratic theory. But if we look back and we look at mental development, we can see the way in which he talked about the more one becomes accustomed and able to use language according to one's own purposes, one is literally freer. You're freer from, and this is a Platonic idea, it goes all the way back to Plato, from your mere appetites or mere sensation. Material objects are freed from being merely material and merely sort of a hammer for a nail. It depends what we use it for. And what we use it for will change what it means in language. And so he says here in particular, in talking about linguistic artifacts, and when he says artifacts, he means these instrumentalities. I should probably end it there, but one of the questions I have after that is, what's the relationship to language in the history of progress tending towards more free interactions? I think there's an open question there. Is learning to use language to enrich experience and anticipate or use in more creative ways the things in our world, is what relationship does this have to what Dewey considers to be the history of progress? Is this the history of progress for Dewey? Or is it only a sort of a strand of a larger cable? So I should probably end it there. The rest of the stuff I can get into in the Q&A if it comes up. But I think what we get with Dewey is a living account of meaning, an account of meaning that is almost one-to-one with the ways in which we use language, the ways in which we navigate the world. There ends up being much less conflict between what we suppose words mean and, well, we use this term in this way, we use it for these purposes, and yet we're told it means something else. I think we're able to account for the way language changes easier. Okay, anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just shift the tech here real quick. There we go. So Stephen says he wants to take his own questions.
All right. If there is a Zoom question, I'm not seeing it, just let me know.
Stephen, do you have any idea if Dewey was influenced or associated with the Sapir Whorf at all?
That is such a good question. I know he was interacting with other philosophers. I haven't seen that. I don't know for sure. If anyone else, there are a lot of Dewey people in the room. I don't know if anyone knows if Dewey read Sapir Whorf or interacted with either of them or wrote about them.
I just think of the progression of his ideas over time, kind of reflecting the general progression of thinking about language during that period.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I almost see Dewey's philosophy of language here as providing perhaps a less deterministic version of what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis tries to get at, where you can sometimes end up in a place after Sapir-Whorf where you think that the structure, the freely given structure of the language that you learn determines and legislates the structure of your mind. I think Dewey would certainly make some room that the particularities of the language you inherit certainly leave impressions and shape the way you interpret the world in certain ways. But that is because of the uses and the ways of interacting with an environment on the part of a people and a culture created that language and created that way of seeing the world which reflected their purposes. And so then that will have an influence. But that influence also, as our purposes change, the language will transform. The language transforms with the way that we use it. And Dewey, I think, gives us a really clear and in some ways almost obvious model of how of how that happens. And so we sort of have, as long as we can sort of break out of seeing the structures of language as freely given, as just sort of that's how they are, we don't know how they got there, then we can sort of be more receptive to
They
that.
seem to be sort of paralleling the early development of sociolinguistics.
Yeah, I mean,
Or even preceding.
I think, yeah, there's certainly a lot of aspects of Dewey that are ahead of his time. And, you know, with this, I mean, he's got social philosophy and, sociological applications here. He's got linguistics and philosophy of language. He's got anthropology. I mean, his work occupies a lot of different spaces.
Sure.
So you mentioned this one-to-one at the end and like your conclusion, which made me think what Dewey's philosophy of language maybe leaves out. So with this idea of like meaning as reflective of the means or language and how we use the world, is there anything more that language can do or does?
For sure. I mean, this is the later stuff. This is in a period where he's really focused on these sorts of, interactional sort of problem solving means ends, view. I think you get more of that in the earlier Dewey, where he's particularly experienced in nature. It's certainly still there in the logic. When we're talking about the ability of language to abstract as a form, I think there's a lot of room for creativity, precisely because we are then liberated from the necessities of existence as we experience it. It's in the ability to refer to things that don't exist or that are not currently present that we get a lot of more creativity. And so I think that's still there in Dewey. It has less of a focus in the later period, but I don't think Dewey would want to end up sounding so mechanistic, even though that is somewhat what he's criticized for. It is to some extent an open question as far as how much of that room for creativity in the abstraction is there left in the late 90-year-old Dewey. I don't think he's completely forgotten about it.
Let me follow up.
Yeah.
With the second question that's connected. I know you know a lot about Peirce and his semiotics. How you see Dewey's theory of language, which language is science, of course, fitting into Peirce's semiotics, or maybe it doesn't. If it does fit, where?
Yeah, so I think this would be, a potential whole paper or thesis could be written on, what are the real and potential relationships between Dewey's philosophy of language and Peirce's, theory of science. Certainly Dewey was reading Peirce, especially in the later period. He has an essay on Peirce's linguistic theory of signs, which I also mentioned in my earlier version of this paper. Dewey reads that, and then in What Is It to Be a Linguistic Sign or Name, he starts talking about signs and symbols, and he even has a triadic classification of how we may think about linguistics after the fact. The triad, though, is more to do with past, present, and future. He's not gonna come out and say, firstness, secondness, thirdness, guys, just like Peirce. I think what Dewey means by a sign is what Peirce means by an index. And what Dewey means by a symbol, I think, is amenable to what Peirce means by a symbol. Even though it's doesn't quite have all those technicalities fleshed out. Dewey certainly takes from Peirce the way in which real living processes are the lifeblood of sign relations and semiosis, although I don't know if Dewey would, quite go there and say semiosis or say sign relations. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, I think you would have to look at them both very carefully, and then, I mean, maybe I'll do that sometime in the future, and just see what the amenability between them is.
And the one exciting part for me was the talk three.
Yeah.
And that starts to bring in those signs related to first. You have potentiality.
Yeah, I think Dewey would definitely, I mean, inexperience in nature, I think this is there, that experience is it's always going to be a fertile ground for freedom, for the development of freedom. And experience is always going to be where, I mean, it's where we always are to some extent. But it's also bringing our analysis back down to the level of experience can also give us a way in which to have more freedom, and not be tied down to what he says and what he calls in how we think are dead symbols. So this is a big part of his educational theory, is that we don't want these entities in language, and the things that we use in them and that become part of language to be taught denuded from experiential context. It's always by it's going to be in part by reintegrating symbols and into experienced situations that we're going to be able to reinterpret them and then abstract and creatively play with future ways of using them.
Where's the dead symbol? Where's that mentioned?
That's in How We Think. As pages 230 to 236, where he talks, the chapter is Language and the Training of Thought.
Considered art as experience or any of his manuscripts on art and aesthetics? You think about language and its theory of language.
Yeah, so Dewey mentions art and aesthetics, and I think he's calling back to art as experience in I believe it is Communication and Culture is the manuscript in which he does that. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read all of Dewey's corpus yet. Art as experience is certainly I will be needing to read that. Stuff about the live creature is certainly going to be very important here, especially if we want to gather a philosophy of language from Dewey and in Dewey that is Dewey's, that is taking into account the affective ways in which the organic partner, as he later says, is, we don't want to end up with this kind of mechanized conception of the human, the subject, that doesn't have a lot of life to it. And so, but I have not.
To get us away from the things that Max Black was worried about. One of the things Black was worried about was structures of metaphor. And he mechanizes metaphor in a way that I don't think Dewey and the other pragmatists do. It might be another.
Absolutely. I'll definitely have to look at that. Yeah. Thank you.
Go look at the chapter on expression. Language.
Just gonna write that down.
There's a distinction, I forget exactly the terminology, but there's a distinction between the kind of expression you get in artistic expression and he calls it description or signification or something, like literal description. Be helpful.
That reminds me a bit of what Heidegger calls the earth and the worldhood of a work of art. Thank you.
In your explorations of this topic so far, do you think Dewey has a view on the debate between compositionality of meaning and semantic holism that was was so important in sort of late 20th century analytic philosophy of language. Does he think that, does he have a kind of building block theory of meaning in the relationship between words and sentences and larger pieces of language? Or does he have a view closer to, say, Davidson's view, where meaning is determined more holistically?
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with Davidson, and so I can't really answer the latter part. I don't think it's a building block theory per se. I mean, Torrius Midgarten does a really great job in his paper Dewey's Philosophy of Language, analyzing the logic and finding that he thinks it's there in the logic, and I think he has a good case. I think more can be said about it. I think one helpful place also is in what is it to be a linguistic sign or name? He says that words are concepts or analogous to concepts, and sentences are analogous to judgments. And the way that those play out, and so that later clarification, I think, can retroactively illuminate some stuff in the logic on that. They're going to be, it's not going to be building block. It's going to be, I think, what I would call the circuits of interaction that they play into. So what specific processes, are they rooted in? What purposes are they serving? Words and sentences. It's not going to be, it's not going to have all of the technical sort of bells and whistles that a lot of analytic philosophy would have. But Midgarten thinks that Dewey has a semantic theory that actually, in some ways, serves as a background and not sort of a building up. That in some ways the larger, more whole semantics of the language that we inherit feed back and feed into how we interpret the words and the smaller units that we learn and get inculcated into. And he argues also historically that, yeah, he thinks Dewey has pretty much a full-fledged theory of semantics, and that this was ignored because the way it was presented was just like absolutely foreign to the analytic philosophy of language of his time, especially with the influence of logical positivism and stuff like that. That it was there, but it wasn't able to be recognized because it wasn't presented in the way that it usually was at that time.
I have a kind of question about the sources. When you say manuscripts, that means an unpublished work. Is that what that is? Or
yeah, so I ended up finding out that mental development and importance, significance, and meaning were published as part of the critical edition. The former was published in Middle Works Volume 1, I believe, and Importance, Significance, and Meaning was published in the Middle Works Volume, Later Works Volume 16.
but not published during his lifetime, is what you're saying.
Right,
So
right.
it's just, do you have a sense of why things weren't published? Did he just abandon the ideas in some respects, or did he move on to something else, or did he just didn't manage to get them published? Or do they appear, the same ideas appear later in some of the published stuff? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is something, because I mean, there's a lot of normative implications when you're dealing with unpublished manuscripts. You don't want to take it as totally authoritative when they may have had good reason not to publish it. Maybe they distance themselves. And so the way that I go about that is I think, okay, how consonant is this with his published works? If it does seem consonant with his published works, okay, I think that gives us some positive reason to then maybe trust this a little more. There are things that are not at all like anything he's published, then that gives you reason to not take that as authoritative, perhaps reason to take that, to interpret that as perhaps a factor in why he didn't publish it. there are textual apparatuses in the critical edition that can sort of tell the story of each essay and each work and manuscript. For instance, What Is It to Be a Linguistic Signer? Name was not published in his lifetime. And Joanne Boydston's note in there is that he was simply so swamped and so busy and so industrious and working on so many different things that this is one that paper in particular is one of quite a few that never got published simply because he was just doing so much that there's a lot of things that he would have published. And so but wasn't able to purely because of work concerns. And so that she takes that as a defense of why she published it in the critical edition.
That's a hypothesis.
It is.
I wonder if you could line it up with correspondence in any way, if he's writing about what he's going to publish or communication with publishers or anything like that.
Yeah, in that one, she does talk about a letter that Dewey sent to Bentley, where he was working on a bunch of stuff with Bentley, and he was like, "I'm so sorry that I took time off from doing this to write this little thing. What is it to be a linguistic signer name?" But yeah, I mean, we have his correspondence, and that would
I'm adding a lot of work there to you.
just on the pile.
We're in the archive.
I would just trust Joanne Boydston on that.
Yeah.
She's in the weeds.
Oh,
Gotta
yeah.
get more than a hypothesis.
Okay, that's.
Yeah.
She's done the work.
Yeah, that's.
I wonder if you've thought, actually, two things. There's an essay by Dewey, a published essay called Logical Concepts. I think that's the title, or maybe Scientific Concepts, but it's about how children learn language. So I think you might find something there to either, do with what you will. The other thing is, I wonder if you thought about what some people, including me, think about Wittgenstein's appropriation of Dewey's philosophy of language, especially in that section, in the midsection of Experience in Nature, where Dewey talks about bring me a flower and all that. And Wittgenstein in the investigation says, bring me a brick, bring me a slab. They look like they're pretty parallel. One of my former colleagues rather puckishly said, what Wittgenstein does with a brick, Dewey does with a flower. It might be helpful to take a look at that. And I just wondered if you thought of that.
I had not thought of that, and I'm very glad that you introduced it.
If a recent biography of Frank Ramsey is in the indication, there might be a bridge there between pragmatism and Wittgenstein's later philosophy of language.
I have that written down. Thank you so much. No, I mean, like I'm writing that down as you're saying it, because yeah, no, I hadn't thought of either of those things. That'll be really excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's thank Stephen one more time. All right, well, feel free to grab another snack or drink and chat for a while, if you have time. And we'll see you again in the fall. On Friday. Or, oh yes, we'll see many of you on Friday.
Symbol. Very